Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to be giving a slightly different type of talk. I'm an ecologist, and I've made use of CMIP data to project the future of bee populations, which is my study subject under climate change. So that's what I'll be discussing today. So as some context, I study biodiversity of organisms and how it's changing as climate change progresses. And in particular, as main context for my work, as many of you are likely aware, we're seeing biodiversity declines across taxa, across organisms in the Anthropocene. And this is a critical concern globally. Just a few examples of this is illustrated on the left. In recent decades, we've seen increases in the number of threatened mammal, bird, and amphibian species. And also, as one specific example, shown on the right, we're seeing alarmingly high percentages of species in decline in certain insect groups. So for example, a very high proportion of grasshopper species are decreasing in abundance currently. High proportions of butterfly species, dragonfly species, bee, wasp, and ant species are also under decline. And in particular, elucidating or understanding the drivers of these declines is a critical step that we as ecologists are taking currently, particularly because these threatened taxa make important contributions to the function of ecosystems. So their declines could have cascading ecological consequences. On that note, my work focuses on bee declines in particular. As many of you likely know, bees play really critical roles in ecosystems as pollinators. They're the most important pollinators of many wild plants and also of many agricultural crops, which means they sustain natural ecosystems and also give us much of the food we eat, many of the vegetables we eat. We only have thanks to bee pollination. A suite of factors are contributing to bee declines globally that scientists have acknowledged. These factors include habitat loss and homogenization, pesticides and fungicides, parasites and pathogens, and climate change. And amongst these stressors, I'm particularly interested in studying climate change as a threat to bees, both because it's having important effects and because fewer scientists have studied climate change relative to some of these other drivers of bee declines. For example, one review published in 2016 found that only 3.2% of the literature on threats to bees that was published between 1989 and 2016 focused on climate change, which has left us with a large knowledge gap to fill. I've been incredibly fortunate to have the data necessary to address related research questions thanks to the Sevietta Long-Term Ecological Research Program, or SEV-LTER. The work in this program is conducted in the southwestern United States in the state of New Mexico, about an hour south of the city of Albuquerque at the Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge, shown here on this map. It's a U.S. National Science Foundation funded program, and ecological data have been collected there since the late 1980s in ecosystem types that are associated, that are characteristic of the southwestern U.S. My work has in particular made use of a long-term bee monitoring data set that was established at the Sevietta by my co-author, Dr. Karen Wright, who's shown up here. She established this data set in 2002. And to monitor bees, what we do is in 3 different ecosystem types that are characteristic of the southwestern US, we set out passive funnel traps that I've shown here in an image on the right. The colors in the traps are attractive to bees. When bees are caught, they're then identified to the species level. And this provides us with a record of how bee abundance and also bee diversity have changed over time. We've collected over 340 different species of bees in this system so far, making this a real hotspot of bee biodiversity and a really incredible place to study these topics. Studying the role of climate as a driver of bee population trends is particularly relevant, I think, in the southwestern US because we have strong evidence that the climate is becoming both drier and more variable interannually at a regional level. The maps here illustrate trends in the drought index SPI, which captures both temperature and precipitation. And the map on the left shows changes in mean aridity or dryness on the landscape. Blue indicates locations where conditions have become cooler and wetter than average, and red indicates where conditions have become drier, more arid on average, which has been the case in the southwestern US where I work. And then importantly for my work at the same time, year-to-year variance in aridity, which is indicated on the right, has also increased over time in the same region. We're seeing in the southwestern US that climate is becoming more variable from year to year. And while previous research has considered how certain important insect species are responding to shifts in mean climate conditions, very little work has at the same time examined ecological responses to changes in climate variability over time. So on that note, with my collaborators, we developed a framework that we call climate sensitivity functions to consider organismal responses to changes in both climate mean and variability. And so in building these climate sensitivity functions, we can depict them as used in this graph on the right. We consider the relationship between a climate driver, such as a drought index on the x-axis, and an ecological response, for instance, bee abundance in our case on the y-axis. And in particular, a nonlinear relationship like we see here between these two variables signals the importance potentially of climate variability in determining the ecological response, while if we were to see a linear relationship, that would indicate that changes in climate mean might be more important. To illustrate a bit more what I'm talking about here, if we have a concave up quadratic function like we see in blue on this graph in this portion, this would indicate a situation in which variance around the climate mean suggested by these arrows would be beneficial ecologically, as years with these more favorable or cooler, wetter climate values create large benefits, and years with less favorable conditions produce only small declines. However, if we see a concave down quadratic relationship, this would indicate that the opposite is true. So more stressful conditions produce only small increases, while less stressful conditions produce only small increases, while more stressful conditions produce large declines, resulting in climate variance being costly overall. And then finally, if we see a complex cubic relationship, such as that illustrated by this full curve, this represents a scenario in which variance may be either costly or beneficial, depending on the climate mean, depending on where we are on this graph. And importantly, a change in mean climate under climate change as the years go on could shift us from a situation in which variance is overall beneficial to a situation where variance might be instead costly. So I was interested specifically in examining how bee abundance tracked aridity in our historic data for different bee species, and then using those relationships to predict how bees might respond to future increases in the mean and the variance of aridity. So building these climate sensitivity functions and then combining them with projected future climate data to predict bee abundance levels into the future. We were also interested in identifying the role of bee physiology in determining or mediating the shapes of these climate sensitivity functions, and ultimately determining how bees are responding to climate change. So what we did in this work, we took experimental measures of the thermal and desiccation or dryness tolerances of bees to link our long-term bee abundance patterns from our historic data to physiology. In doing so, just to kind of summarize the questions we were asking with this work, we were examining, first of all, how sensitive is bee abundance to climate and how will bee abundance change under future climate scenarios? And second of all, does physiology predict sensitivity to climate change? CMIP data were a really crucial part of this work. Just to briefly describe what we did, how we used these data. We obtained projected mean monthly temperature and total monthly precipitation data derived from CMIP 5 models for the years 2021 through 2100 through the Climate NA software package. This package was published by Wang et al. There's a 2016 publication detailing it, but they are continuing to come out with new versions. And the software will interpolate temperature and precipitation values for a particular location on the landscape in a particular year going out into the future until 2100. Just a quick note, CMIP 6 data are now available via the software package, but were not at the time when we ran our main models for the project, hence our use of CMIP 5 data. And just as a bit more detail, in particular, we use data available through the Climate NA software package for 6 different GCMs, and we predicted future bee abundance under 3 different climate change scenarios. So RCPs 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5. And this allowed us to examine a range of different possibilities that could occur under climate change. So what did we find with this work, just to walk you through a few of our results? Excitingly, we found that bee abundance really strongly tracked climate. Abundance tracked aridity in 71% of the bee populations that we examined. So this indicates that climate is a really strong driver of bee population dynamics in this system. In particular, in building our climate sensitivity functions, we found that abundance relationships with aridity ranged from linear to quadratic and cubic, and that's indicated in this graph over here of the number of cases in which each of these model types shown on top best predicted bee abundance. So considering all of this, our results suggest that certain bee populations will be influenced by future changes in climate mean alone, indicated in these cases where the linear model was best. But in other populations, they'll be influenced by changes in variance alone, indicated here, and in still other populations, changes in both climate mean and variance in the future are predicted to have an effect on abundance of bees. We next use the long-term bee monitoring data to consider historic bee abundance trends and a modeling framework, again, reliant on the CMIP data to predict bee abundance trends into the future. This is a phylogenetic tree, so a tree of life where each tip or each kind of ending point indicates a different bee species in our system. And our models project that 44% of bees will either increase in abundance, indicated in blue on this phylogeny, or not change in abundance, indicated in gray, as we move into the future. So our projections success a fair degree of resilience to climate change within this community, which is reason for hope from a biodiversity perspective. However, 46% of species, those indicated in red in this plot, so nearly half of species in this system are projected to decline. So we see a really mixed picture in terms of the future of bee abundance in this system. In terms of the role of physiology from our thermal and desiccation tolerance experiments, we obtained evidence linking bees' abundance trends to their physiology. So what we see here in these graphs, for 12 bee genera, 12 bee groups indicated in different colors as different points. We have in these graphs physiological tolerance to heat and desiccation from our experiments shown on the x-axis of both plots. That's a combined metric that gives an overall sense of tolerance to heat and drought. In the top panel on the y-axis, we have linear parameter estimate from the climate sensitivity function, and positive values indicate that bees increased in abundance as aridity increased in our historic record, while negative values indicate that bees decreased in abundance under higher aridity. And then in the lower panel on the y-axis, we have magnitude of change in abundance over time. So have bees increased in abundance over time in the historic record versus decreased? And what we see here is the genera that best tolerated heat and desiccation both increased the most strongly over time under aridity in terms of their abundance. Both increased most strongly with aridity and increased most strongly over time as those arid conditions increased. So basically, this connects climate change and physiology to long-term abundance trends in these species. And finally, to bring this all together, in zooming out to consider the full bee community, our models project less diverse but still abundant bee assemblages for our region in the future. So the graph on the left shows the magnitude of change in predicted abundance through the next century for the 50 most abundant bee species in the system, with these species colored by genus on the graph as they were on the last page. And what we see here is amongst these most abundant species kind of clustered on the left side of the graph, a higher number are predicted to decline, so predicted to be in the negative relative to those predicted to increase. However, the abundance increases projected for a small number of species kind of balance out the abundance declines projected for a larger number of species, so that if we look across the bee community, as is seen on the right, at total abundance, so summing across all species, we see predicted stability. We see that abundance is not predicted to increase or decrease because declines of some species are balancing out increases in others. If we look across the full bee assemblage. So what does this all mean for the future of bee biodiversity? What this work indicates is that climate change will likely reshape bee assemblages or groups of bees with some species declining and others persisting. In a sense, this is good news, both for bee population health and for the pollination of plants, in that this indicates resilience to climate change to a certain degree, but loss of some bee species means loss of pollination function for the plants that are reliant on those bees. So this is an indication that we need to take climate change very seriously in terms of its threats to bee biodiversity. This work also indicates the importance of considering bees' direct responses to climate that are mediated by their physiology, as we saw. And I think it really illustrates the value of combining trait data, so physiology measurements, with long-term abundance data, along with historic and projected future climate data to predict future biodiversity scenarios. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the many, many people who were involved in making this work possible. We particularly received funding from the National Science Foundation and support from the University of New Mexico, where I was based to conduct this work, and had a number of co-authors and field and lab assistants. And then I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and my contact information is listed right here. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was really, really interesting. We've got a question actually from Simon in the chat asking, do different bee species have different roles in the ecosystem, and therefore would changes in species abundance impact overall ecosystem functioning?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And the answer is yes. So we have these 340 different bee species. Some of them are what we call generalists that pollinate a number of different plant species. And some of them are what we call specialists that will only pollinate a few different species, or a set of species from, let's say, the same plant family. In addition, amongst the generalists, they can shift their behavior quite frequently. So while they pollinate a large number of different species at any given time, they might be kind of specializing for just a few of them, given what's abundant on the landscape. So these bees are playing different roles within the ecosystem in terms of which plants they're capable of pollinating or are pollinating in a given moment. and therefore loss of any single species could have major impacts on the ecosystem. There are some cases where certain species are relatively functionally redundant. So sometimes we have two species, both of which are pretty broad generalists. They're mainly playing the same role. Loss of one of those species might have less of an impact versus loss of a really specialized species. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. We've also actually now got a question from Paul in the chat, asking you to comment on the importance of climate stressors versus habitat loss, agricultural or pesticide pressures, or even other upstream changes that lead to downstream changes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the location where I did this work is a fairly isolated national wildlife refuge that's free from a lot of the other stressors that are present on the landscape for bees. So that kind of allowed us to consider the effects of climate change in isolation. But the reality is that in the vast majority of bee populations around the world, they're experiencing the threats of multiple stressors simultaneously. So habitat loss, agricultural pesticides, exposure to disease, those could all co-occur. And bees could be impacted by climate change at the same time as they're experiencing these other stressors. So more and more research is now considering if a bee that's under stress from pesticide exposure experiences heat stress, how will that affect its survival and reproduction? Kind of the next frontier is considering specifically how these stressors will interact to impact bee fitness and population health. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I don't see any other hands or questions in the chat now. So thank you so much for your really great presentation, really interesting and like a slightly different topic than we normally have, which was really nice. And thanks again to all of our speakers today, Melanie, Tim, and Zeb. It was a really great seminar, and yeah, thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.